right, fourth grade. Do one last mini lesson with multiplicative comparisons today. It's really just about the language we can use to do it. I noticed this was a tough skill on a formative that we took the other day, and so I just want to take a minute to kind of go back over this and make clear how some multiplication language works today. So make this the title on the next free page in your math notebook. After you have done that, mark that page with your pencil, close it up, unpause, and give me your concentration till we get to the we do. Alright, so just to get you back your mind on multiplicative comparisons, been spending several days on statements like these. This was one from a mini lesson yesterday. Sabrina has 3 times more books than her friend Ruby. So we've been looking at this kind of language. Multiplicative, because it involves multiples of things. So multiplicative comes from this part of the language. And comparison comes from this, more or less. Remember in math, when we use the word compare, we're talking about value, something being more or less than another value. So we're comparing using multiplication, and that's been our skill for the last few days. So this is going to be a pretty straightforward task today. So when we talk about multiplication, I've just put 2 multiplication factors and products up here. And so I want to talk about some language we can use to look at these as comparisons rather than just multiplication problems. So when we look at something like this, if we want to take this and talk about it as a multiplicative comparison, we want to have that times more language in the sentence. Then we're talking about multiplication as a multiplicative comparison. So when I look at this, there's 2 ways I can word this. I can kind of say, something is something times more than something else. That's a multiplicative comparative language. So you can see I have the multiplicative language in there, and I have the comparative language in there, more than. And so when I look at a basic multiplication fact like 7 times 5 equals 35, if I think of that in terms of comparison, I'm really saying like, 35 is 7 times more than 5. Right? I'm just like, I can think of it that way. I can say 35 is 7 times more than 5, like I'm taking 5 and doing it 7 times in a tape diagram or something like that. And so that's one kind of multiplicative sentence I can take out of here. 35 is 7 times more than 5. I can also think of it a second way and kind of reverse those values there. I can also think of it as 35 is 5 times more than 7 also. Those can be done either way. I can also think about getting my 35 by doing a tape diagram with 5, 7. So I can think it's, 5 times more than 7, or I can think it's 7 times more than 5. They're both valid comparisons that I can make with the language there. So let's just look at one where, it's the same idea with one where it isn't necessarily like a multiplication fact you would memorize. It's one you would have worked out with a multiplication strategy. But I can still do the same thing. I can still use that comparative language here. That is something times more than something else, right? There's my multiplicative comparative language. I'll highlight it. Times more than. That's how I know I'm talking about a multiplicative comparison. So I can take this multiplication problem and I can turn it into a multiplicative comparison. I can say, if I first go this way to get to 476, I can say 476 is 34 times more than 14. And I can also say, if I think the other way, think of it more as being 34 times 14, I can say, 476 is also 14 times more than 34. So it's just 2 sentences I can make out of a multiplication fact, and I saw that that was pretty tough on a formative that we did earlier, so I wanted to bring back up. So go ahead and open your math notebook, and we'll just do one that you wouldn't have memorized. We'll look at this multiplication fact right here. So this is sort of a multiplication, I guess, problem, you would probably call it. And I want to turn that into, I just want to make sure you know how to turn that into a multiplicative comparison. And remember, those are, we practiced writing those out with like something times something equals something else. And so when we make that into a sentence, we're still going to have those 3 somethings to fill in. So I'm going to write that out in language as one of the things, there's my first blank, is blank times more than blank. So I have 3 blanks kind of in my sentence, just like I did when we wrote them out with mathematics. I'm gonna write this 2 times because every multiplication problem can be written out as 2 separate multiplicative comparisons. So I'm going to kind of set them both up to do it once. So if I think of it the way it's written as 28 times 54 equals 1512. Imagine a situation like so-and-so has 28 of something, somebody has 54 times more. Then I would think of it kind of that way, as like 28 is 54 times more, where that's kind of the multiplier. 54 times more. Oh, I didn't do that right. Go back. Thanks for catching that. 1512 this is sort of my times more than, 54 times more than 28. And also, if I think of just kind of reversing my multiplication to 54 times 28, then I would sort of reverse that and say, I could also think of it as 1512 is 28 times more than 54, where kind of this is my multiplier. This is whatever the first person has, 54, books or whatever. And we end up with the person with more, 1512. So that's just how to turn your multiplication problem into a multiplicative comparison with language. This is easier to do in context, when we have an actual situation where we're not just using numbers, but it's like books or cars or whatever, they've been in past problems. But once in a while you're asked to just do it with a multiplication problem too, and I wanted to make sure you could. Once you have this written down, if this all kind of made sense and you feel confident about it coming into class tomorrow, you're all set. If not, go back and listen through the I do or the we do a couple more times to make sure that you feel good about this and it makes sense before you call it a night. And other than that, I'll see you tomorrow.